Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping into a completely fascinating era defined by powdered wigs, razor-sharp intellects, and incredibly strict rules. We are decoding the 18th century in English literature. It's a time when writers basically decided that logic and biting wit were the absolute peak of human achievement, and honestly, being called a copycat was the highest possible compliment you could get. So let's get into it.
Here is our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start with a welcome to the Augustan Age, then look at copying the classical greats, followed by reason, logic, and satire. After that, we'll explore coffee houses and city life, and we'll wrap it all up with Alexander Pope and poetic form. All right, Section 1. Welcome to the Augustan Age, the many names of the 18th century.
Okay, let's dive into this. The 18th century is an era with a bit of an identity complex, to be honest. It's not just called the 18th century, it's also known as the Neoclassical Age, or the Age of Pope, or even the Age of Johnson. And, the very fact that a single century needs this many aliases tells us we're dealing with an era heavily defined by massive, dominant personalities who set the absolute standard for everyone else. But the official title, the big one, is the Augustan Age. Now, you might be wondering why. Well, it's actually a super bold historical comparison. Think back to Emperor Augustus. His reign was the undisputed golden age of Latin literature, and English writers of the 18th century genuinely believed their own society had reached a parallel peak. They were proudly and very loudly claiming to be the modern equivalent of Rome's greatest era.
Moving right along to Section 2, copying the classical greats, the rules of the game.
So how did they prove they were the new golden age? Just take a look at this advice given by the prominent critic Walsh to a young Alexander Pope. He said, "The best of the modern poets in all languages are those that have nearest copied the ancients." Now, today, we absolutely prize originality, right? But back then, no way. Sheer imitation was considered the absolute pinnacle of literary genius. You didn't invent a new style, you perfected your mimicry of the Greek and Latin masters. And that, in a nutshell, is why they're the neoclassicists. And because they followed these classical blueprints so obsessively, our source textbook actually makes a massive, definitive claim. It dubs this the Indispensible Century. The argument here is that by establishing these rigid classical rules, and by formalizing the English language into something highly structured and logical, this era laid a bedrock foundation that English literature literally could not do without.
But I absolutely love this handwritten note in the margins from a rebellious student that pushes back on that grand claim. It just asks, what about Elizabethan? And it's a fantastic question, isn't it? Does the 18th century truly hold the crown as the indispensable era, or does the age of Shakespeare take it? It just goes to show that these grand Augustan claims are still up for a really healthy debate today.
Okay, Section 3. Reason, logic, and satire. The era of arguments. Let's look at the philosophy behind the poetry.
You see, this era championed the mind above all else. It was intellectual, it was logical, rational, and highly satirical. But to elevate all that logic, they made a massive sacrifice. Their work conspicuously lacks emotion, imagination, and passion. To the neoclassicist, emotion was just chaotic. They intentionally traded away deep, messy human feelings for perfect, rational order.
Which leads us to this brilliant, honestly, kind of cutting description of the era's literature from our source text. It describes it as the product of intelligence playing upon the surface of life. I just love this phrasing. It implies that while these writers were incredibly smart and razor-sharp, they rarely actually dove into the messy depths of the human soul. They stayed comfortably on the surface, analyzing society, observing manners, and just arguing over intellect. So, what exactly happens when you suppress all that emotion and focus entirely on logical arguments? Well, you get satire. Because it was a highly didactic era, meaning they really wanted to instruct and correct people, satire became the ultimate weapon. It was aimed at social norms, political figures, and even personal enemies. If you wanted to destroy someone's reputation in the 18th century, you didn't challenge them to a physical duel. No, you wrote a flawlessly structured, logically devastating poem about them. That brings us to Section 4. Coffee houses and city life, the urban focus. Now, you might be wondering, where exactly were all these highly logical, deeply satirical arguments taking place? The backdrop for this intense intellectual combat is entirely urban. The poetry of this age deals almost exclusively with town life, aristocratic circles, and human manners. They actively dismissed rural life and the natural world. Remember, nature is wild and unpredictable, which is everything the rational Augustan writer wanted to avoid. Much like a modern social media echo chamber, they wanted the controlled, predictable elegance of the city. And this brilliantly illustrates just how enclosed their world actually was. The textbook states their literary outlook was totally circumscribed, or limited, to coffee houses and drawing rooms. Just picture it for a second: wealthy aristocratic men in smoky London cafes, drinking this trendy newly imported beverage called coffee, debating politics, and reading biting satires to one another. It was a brilliant but incredibly confined little world. Finally, Section 5, Alexander Pope and Poetic Form, Mastering the Couplet. Let's break down the actual mechanics of how they wrote. Almost all 18th century poetry used what we call closed heroic couplets. This means 2 rhyming lines of verse, written in iambic pentameter, that classic da-dum, da-dum, da-dum rhythm, that contain a fully complete grammatical thought. The textbook prizes this for its epigrammatic terseness. Basically, it's short, punchy, and hits you like a quick, rational 1-2 punch. Because the entire thought is closed within just 2 rhyming lines, it is literally the perfect delivery system for a witty, devastating insult. And the undisputed heavyweight champion of this hyper-logical urban literary scene was Alexander Pope. His major early works include Pastorals, an essay on criticism, and Windsor Forest. But his final 2 great works are where he really weaponized the rules of his age. Notice how the notes here correctly classify The Rape of the Lock as a mock epic and the Dunciad as pure satire. Pope used those tight, closed couplets to completely mock aristocratic vanity and just mercilessly destroy his literary rivals.
So that wraps up our deep dive into the Augustan Age. We've seen how they worshipped the classics, elevated logic way above passion, and basically turned poetry into a precision tool for social critique in London's elite coffee houses. But as we finish up, I want to leave you with a provocative question to think about. When we look back at this era of neoclassicism, we really have to ask ourselves, does suppressing emotion truly create perfect poetry? Or does it just create perfect arguments? It's a fascinating debate, and it's one that still shapes how we view art and literature today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.